They didn't bury the saint, they carved him up, framed the theft as divine, and slept soundly beside the scattered bones. Guys, welcome once again to a boring history for sleep story, taken from the most brutal side of history, where today holiness earns its keep, one glittering fragment at a time. If you're still awake after this, I wouldn't have done my job properly, so please drop a lightly abusive comment, tap like, hit subscribe, and tune in tomorrow to give it another try. Don't forget to mention where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Your small nod keeps these midnight confessions flowing. Tonight they exhume a corpse, snap off a gleaming shinbone, and watch Europe kneel. Forged miracles will travel farther than faith ever could. Close your eyes. The voice settles over you like incense ash drifting from a guttering candle. A faint fire crackles somewhere beyond the dark, while warm sheets cocoon your limbs, and each slow breath draws you deeper into the hush. Memory stirs. Stone corridors slick with winter, torchlight licking crimson tapestries. The air thick with wax and old secrets. You glide barefoot past cabinets of ribs, teeth, and hollowed skulls, each swaddled in silk, crowned in gold, tagged with a saint's borrowed name. Monks in black drift by, palms folded, eyes lowered, their silence broken only by the clink of coins. Somewhere ahead, a fresh spine waits to be blessed, displayed, and sold, and your hands, so steady, are already polishing the bones. Sleep descends. The relic marketplace is about to be born. Take a deep breath, and imagine, if you will, a severed human toe arriving in a small French village in the year 847. Not just any toe, mind you. This particular digit supposedly belonged to Saint Bartholomew, you know, the apostle who was skinned alive, because nothing says sweet dreams quite like dismembered holy appendages. Our story begins in the sleepy village of Bully-sur-Dordogne, where Father Guillaume has just received a mysterious package from Rome. Inside, wrapped in silk that's seen better days, lies what appears to be a remarkably well-preserved big toe. The accompanying letter claims it's genuine Saint Bartholomew, authenticated by the Pope himself. The fact that the Pope's seal looks suspiciously fresh, and the Latin contains several grammatical errors, well, who's counting when you got yourself a genuine miracle? Father Guillaume, armed with more ambition than theological accuracy, immediately recognizes opportunity when he sees it, or smells it. The toe, you see, has developed a rather distinctive aroma, somewhere between aged cheese and divine intervention. But Guillaume knows that in the relic business, presentation is everything. Within days, he's constructed an elaborate display. The toe now rests on purple velvet, inside a crystal reliquary that cost more than the church's annual budget. Candles flicker dramatically. Incense masks most of the smell. And Guillaume has perfected his pitch. Behold, the blessed toe of Saint Bartholomew. Touch it and be healed, gaze upon it and find salvation, leave a generous donation and receive a blessing. Word spreads faster than the plague, which coincidentally is also spreading, making miracle cures particularly marketable. Within weeks, pilgrims begin arriving. First a trickle, local farmers with bad backs and suspicious rashes, then a flood. Merchants, nobles, even a bishop or two, all eager to press their lips against the glass containing the sacred digit. The village economy transforms overnight. Where once there was a single tavern, now there are 5. Street vendors sell blessed bread that's remarkably similar to regular bread, but costs 3 times as much. Local craftsmen produce miniature toe replicas in wood, clay, and, for the wealthy, silver. Everyone's making money hand over fist. Or should we say, toe over heel. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting I mean completely absurd. The nearby abbey of St. Denis, watching Berlioz's prosperity with barely concealed envy, suddenly announces they too have acquired a relic. Not just any relic, they claim to possess St. Bartholomew's other big toe, because apparently the saint was remarkably careless with his extremities. This sparks what historians politely call competitive relic acquisition, and what we might call a holy arms race of human body parts. The Cathedral of Troyes declares they have John the Baptist's index finger. Not to be outdone, the monks at Cluny reveal they've been hiding St. Peter's kneecap all along. A small convent near Paris shyly admits they possess 3 teeth from St. Catherine. Nobody asks why a virgin martyr would have spare teeth lying around. Questions like that are bad for business. But wait, it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective and proximity to dinner. The Cathedral of Amiens makes a shocking announcement. They have acquired the head of John the Baptist, the actual head. Never mind that the Cathedral of San Silvestro in Rome has been displaying John's head for centuries, or that Damascus also claims to have it, or that there are now approximately 6 heads of John the Baptist scattered across Christendom. Clearly, the Baptist was part Hydra. It's the only logical explanation. The multiplication of holy body parts reaches truly biblical proportions. By 850, there are enough fragments of the true cross in circulation to build a small forest. The Virgin Mary's breast milk appears in no fewer than 40 churches across Europe. One monastery claims to have Christ's foreskin. Another claims to have Christ's foreskin. A third, well, you get the idea. Apparently, the Son of God required multiple circumcisions. Theology is complicated. Back in Bulia, Father Guillaume watches this explosion of sacred remains with mixed feelings. On one hand, competition is fierce. On the other hand, all these relics are bringing unprecedented wealth to the church. And if the church is wealthy, surely that's God's will. The fact that Guillaume has just purchased a rather nice cottage with pilgrim donations is purely coincidental. The toe, meanwhile, has developed quite a reputation. Pilgrims swear it cures everything from gout to grief. A merchant claims it helped him find a lost shipment of wool. A barren woman insists that after praying to the toe she conceived triplets. The fact that her husband returned from a 2-year voyage 9 months before the birth is surely another miracle. But the real miracle is how nobody questions the obvious impossibilities. Take, for instance, the unfortunate case of St. Sebastian. According to various churches, the arrow-riddled saint left behind 4 arms, 6 legs, and enough ribs to reconstruct a small dinosaur. Either Sebastian was a many-limbed marvel, or someone's been shopping at the local cemetery. But pointing this out would be heresy and bad for the economy. The church now smells like a peculiar mixture of incense, unwashed pilgrims, and what can only be described as holy decomposition. But business is booming. Guillaume has hired assistants to manage the crowds. There's a gift shop selling toe-themed trinkets. On busy days, pilgrims queue for hours just to glimpse the miraculous digit. Other churches take note. If Bulia can build an empire on a toe, imagine what you could do with a whole foot. Or better yet, an entire arm. The Cathedral of Canterbury announces they've acquired St. Thomas Becket's elbow. Venice proudly displays what they claim is St. Mark's thumb. A tiny chapel in Germany insists they have St. Ursula's little finger, along with fingers from several of her 11,000 virgin companions. That's a lot of fingers. One might say, suspiciously many fingers. The authentication process for these relics is, shall we say, flexible. Typically, it involves a bishop squinting at a body part, consulting some definitely not forged documents, and declaring it genuine. Sometimes there's a miracle to prove authenticity. The relic might bleed or glow, or smell like roses instead of rotting flesh. These miracles tend to occur most frequently when donation baskets are light. By the end of the 9th century, every church worth its salt, blessed salt naturally, 30% markup, has at least one body part on display. Some have entire collections. The Cathedral of Cologne boasts a treasury that looks less like a house of worship and more like an anatomy lesson conducted by someone with poor organizational skills and a flexible relationship with reality. Pilgrims don't seem to mind the obvious duplications and impossibilities. They come in droves, seeking healing, forgiveness, or just a good story to tell back home. They leave offerings, coins, jewelry, livestock, sometimes their own children dedicated to the church. It's a thriving economy built entirely on bones, blood, and blind faith. And somewhere in Bulia, Father Guillaume counts his coins by candlelight, occasionally glancing at the toe that started it all. Is it really St. Bartholomew's? Does it matter? The pilgrims believe, the money flows, the church grows richer, and if God had a problem with any of this, surely he would have sent a sign. The scene apparently is more toes. Always more toes. Sleep tight, and try not to think about where your local church might be hiding its collection of medieval body parts. They're probably in the basement, right next to the donation records. Ah, the 11th century. A time of conquest, crusades, and competitive corpse collection. While normal people were busy dying from various plagues and invasions, the Church had discovered the ultimate business model. Dead saints were worth more than gold. Much more if you knew how to market them properly. By now, relic collecting had evolved from a quirky hobby into a full Kamashna sport. Monasteries competed like merchant houses, except instead of spices and silk, they traded in sanctified skulls and hallowed humeri. It was capitalism meets Catholicism, with a generous sprinkle of grave robbing. Let's visit Brother Benedict at the Abbey of Fleury, where he's just returned from what he calls a pilgrimage and what we might call international body snatching. He's exhausted, covered in mud, and absolutely delighted. Why? Because hidden in his travel sack is what he claims to be the rib of St. George. Now, you might notice this rib is rather large, suspiciously large, almost as if it came from something that might have breathed fire rather than slayed dragons. But Brother Benedict has an answer for everything. St. George was a mighty warrior, he explains, cradling the massive bone. Naturally, his ribs would be heroic in proportion. The other monks nod sagely. After all, questioning relics is bad for morale, and more importantly, bad for business. Benedict isn't alone in his entrepreneurial spirit. Across Europe, a whole shadow economy has emerged. There are professional relic dealers, middlemen who specialize in acquiring and authenticating holy remains. They travel between monasteries like pharmaceutical sales reps, carrying cases filled with finger bones and tooth fragments. This week only, they might say, buy 2 apostle knuckles, get a martyr's toenail free. The authentication process has become surprisingly sophisticated, by which I mean surprisingly creative. Forged papal documents are so common they have their own scriptoriums. These underground workshops produce aging parchment with practiced ease, complete with convincing wax seals and Latin so flowery it would make Cicero weep. For the right price, you can get papers proving your mouldy femur belonged to anyone from St. Augustine to Abraham himself. One particularly enterprising forger in Rome has developed a sliding scale. Minor saints cost less to authenticate than apostles, martyrs command premium prices, and anything claiming to be from Christ himself requires what he delicately calls a substantial investment in documentation. He's been excommunicated 3 times. It hasn't affected business. Meanwhile, the actual acquisition of relics has become an art form. Gone are the days of simply claiming a toe appeared miraculously. Now monks organize what can only be described as holy heist operations. Take the infamous Venetian Job of 1094. Merchants from Venice decided their city needed a proper patron saint. Their choice? St. Mark the Evangelist. Small problem, Mark was buried in Alexandria, Egypt, under Muslim control. Did this stop them? Of course not. The Venetians sent 2 merchants, Buono and Rustico, and yes, those were their actual names, because medieval parents had a sense of humour. Their plan was elegantly simple: steal the body, smuggle it home, profit. The execution was somewhat less elegant. First, they had to bribe the church guards in Alexandria. Then, they had to actually remove St. Mark from his tomb, which had been sealed for centuries and smelled exactly like you'd expect. But the real challenge was getting the corpse past customs. Their solution? They packed St. Mark in a barrel of pork fat and labelled it ham. Because Muslim customs officials wouldn't inspect pork, the plan worked perfectly. St. Mark made it to Venice, where he was installed in a magnificent basilica. The fact that he arrived marinated in pig fat was politely never mentioned in official church histories. Today, tourists flock to see his remains, blissfully unaware they're venerating Christianity's most well-travelled charcuterie. But Venice's success inspired imitators. Soon every city wanted its own stolen saint. Bari snatched St. Nicholas from Turkey. Yes, that St. Nicholas. Santa Claus was a victim of body snatching. Sweet dreams, children. Amalfi grabbed St. Andrew from Constantinople. It was like a medieval crime wave, but with more incense and fewer consequences. The bones business was booming, but supply was becoming a problem. There were only so many saints, and most of them had been thoroughly distributed. Some creative solutions emerged. Enter the miracle of multiplication. Not loaves and fishes this time, fingers and femurs. Monasteries discovered that a single saint could provide seemingly endless relics. Take St. Blay, for instance. According to various churches, he left behind 6 heads, 12 arms, and enough throat bones to reconstruct a giraffe. Either Blay was some sort of medieval mutant, or someone was being creative with their anatomy. The Cathedral of Exeter claimed to have the entire skeleton of St Boniface. So did Fulda Abbey, and Mainz Cathedral, and several other locations. When questioned about these duplications, church officials had ready explanations. God works in mysterious ways, they'd say. Who are we to limit his power to multiply holy remains? It was a theological masterclass in having your saint and selling him too. The real innovations, though, were happening behind monastery walls. Some entrepreneurial monks had discovered that you didn't necessarily need actual saints. You just needed bones and a good story. Brother Adelard of Cluny perfected the technique. He'd quietly purchase skeletons from local grave diggers. For medical study, he'd claim. Then, after a suitable period of prayer and creativity, these anonymous bones would be transformed. That femur obviously belonged to St Juventius, an obscure martyr whose biography Adelard had just happened to discover in a previously unknown manuscript, which he'd written last week. The beauty of inventing saints was that nobody could disprove them. Who's to say there wasn't a Saint Juventius who was martyred by being forced to eat his own sandals? Adelard was particularly proud of that detail. The bones couldn't contradict the story, and the newly minted biography provided plenty of material for sermons and feast days. Other monasteries took note. Soon there was an explosion of previously unknown saints, each with increasingly elaborate backstories. Saint Expectitus, patron of urgent causes, appeared suddenly in several churches. Saint Philomena emerged from the catacombs with a dramatic tale of martyrdom. Saint Attractor of Ireland materialized with a full set of relics and a conveniently vague history. The economics of this bone boom were staggering. A major relic could transform a poverty-stricken monastery into a wealthy institution overnight. Pilgrims brought money, certainly, but also land grants, jewelry, and political influence. Kings and nobles competed to own the most prestigious relics, driving prices sky high. The Bishop of Mainz paid 800 gold pieces for what he believed was St Ursula's skull. The Duke of Burgundy traded 3 villages for a splinter of the true cross. The going rate for an apostle's finger reached levels that would make modern art collectors blush. But perhaps the most audacious relic of all appeared in the early 12th century, the Holy Prépuce. Yes, that's exactly what you think it is, Christ's foreskin, preserved from his circumcision, because apparently someone in ancient Judea had remarkable foresight and a very specific collecting habit. The Abbey of Charroux claimed to have received it from Charlemagne, but then Calcutta in Italy also claimed to have it, as did Santiago de Compostela, and several other churches. The theological implications of multiple holy prepuces were mind-boggling, but nobody seemed eager to pursue that particular debate. By the height of the skull market boom, Europe had become a vast charnel house dressed in gold and silk. Every church had its bones, every monastery its miracles. The faithful came in endless streams, seeking healing, hope, and proximity to the holy dead. And if some of those holy dead were actually unholy peasants who died of plague last winter, well, what the pilgrims didn't know couldn't hurt them. Much. The monks counted their coins, the forgers perfected their craft, the bone merchants travelled their routes, and somewhere in a Venetian basilica, St. Mark continued to marinate in the lingering aroma of pork fat, a testament to the lengths men would go to for a piece of the sacred dead. Close your eyes now, and dream of medieval markets where femurs were currency and skulls were stock options. Dream of monks with muddy hands and creative biographies. Dream of saints who multiplied after death more efficiently than they ever did in life. Tomorrow, another city will discover another relic. The market never sleeps, neither do the dead, not when there's money to be made. Picture, if you will, the year 1123. While normal people were busy with mundane concerns like survival and avoiding leprosy, Europe's religious institutions were engaged in what can only be described as competitive corpse theft. Cities didn't just want relics anymore, they wanted the best relics, the most prestigious pieces, the holiest of holy bones, and they were willing to fight for them. Welcome to the age of relic warfare, where possession was 10/10 of the law and finders were definitely keepers. Our tale begins in Tours, where the Cathedral of St. Gatien has just made a shocking discovery. After centuries of displaying St. Martin's tomb, they've opened it for renovations and found nothing. The tomb is empty. Well, not entirely empty. There's a note. In Latin, it reads, roughly translated, "Thanks for the saint, love Auxerre." The Cathedral of Auxerre, you see, had been envying Tours' prosperity for years. All those pilgrims, all that wealth, all because of one dead bishop. So they did what any reasonable medieval institution would do. They tunnelled under the cathedral, stole the body, and left a passive-aggressive thank you note. Tours was furious. Auxerre was smug. And thus began what historians call the contentious century of corpse custody battles. The techniques for stealing relics had evolved far beyond simple grave robbing. Monasteries employed what we might generously call acquisition specialists. Monks trained in the delicate art of holy body snatching. They studied architectural plans, bribed sacristans, and developed increasingly creative methods for liberating saints from their current accommodations. Brother Theodoric of Regensburg was particularly renowned for his skills. He once managed to steal St. Emmeram's entire skeleton during a feast day celebration, replacing it with pig bones dressed in the saint's vestments. It took the cathedral 6 months to notice the substitution, by which time Emmeram was safely installed in Theodoric's home monastery, performing miracles and attracting donations. But the real masters of relic acquisition were the Normans. Having conquered England, they decided they also needed to conquer the afterlife. Norman churches began what can only be described as a systematic raid on Anglo-Saxon saints. The case of St. Cuthbert is particularly illustrative. The saint had been peacefully decomposing in Durham for centuries, when Norman bishops decided he'd be better off in their new cathedral. Small problem, the locals were rather attached to their saint. Armed locals. What followed was essentially a medieval heist movie. The Normans tried bribery, failed. They tried forgery, claiming papal permission to relocate the saint. The locals couldn't read Latin, but they could smell bullshit. Finally, they tried a midnight raid, which ended with several Norman monks being chased through the streets by angry Saxons wielding agricultural implements. To make matters worse, Alfred's scalp was wielding an axe as well. And it wasn't just Alfred Regent, because it was the imp. In the end, Durham kept its saint, but the Normans learned an important lesson. Sometimes it's easier to steal from foreigners. Which brings us to the Fourth Crusade, history's most successful shopping trip for second-hand saints. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, they didn't just take gold and jewels. Oh no. They took everything that wasn't nailed down, and quite a few things that were. The Venetians, never once to miss a business opportunity, arrived with shopping lists. The head of St. John the Baptist? Packed. The arm of St. George? Grabbed. A significant portion of the True Cross? Divided among the highest bidders. They even took the Virgin Mary's robe, her belt, and, because why not, several vials of her breast milk. One French knight wrote home excitedly about acquiring a jaw of St. Stephen, most wonderfully preserved. His wife wrote back, asking if he'd remembered to also bring the silk she'd requested. Priorities were different in the Middle Ages. But Constantinople's loss was Europe's gain. Suddenly, every 2-bit cathedral could afford a genuine Byzantine relic. The market was flooded, which created a new problem. How do you prove your newly acquired saint is the real deal when there are 6 others just like it? Enter the miracle competition. Cities with competing relics began staging what amounted to supernatural showdowns. Both Sens and Paris claimed to have John the Baptist's head. Fine, let's see which one performed better miracles. The bishops would parade their relics, document their miracles, and engage in fierce theological debates about whose head was holier. These debates could get surprisingly technical. The Bishop of Sens argued that his head was clearly authentic because it still had some hair attached. The Bishop of Paris countered that everyone knew John the Baptist was bald. Didn't he live in the desert? Sens responded that the hair was miraculous post-mortem growth. Paris suggested Sens didn't know the difference between human hair and camel fur. The Pope, when asked to adjudicate, wisely decided both heads were authentic. God, in his infinite power, could certainly provide his saints with spare heads. Case closed. Donations to both churches doubled. But the real drama was happening in Italy, where city-states turned relic theft into a political art form. When Pisa stole St. Matthew from Salerno, Salerno retaliated by stealing St. Agatha from Catania. Catania then stole St. Lucy from Syracuse. It was like a holy pyramid scheme, but with more Latin and less regulatory oversight. The most audacious theft of all was orchestrated by Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor and part-time relic enthusiast. He decided Cologne needed a major attraction to compete with other imperial cities. His solution? Steal the bones of the three kings. Yes, the Magi who brought gifts to baby Jesus from Milan. The Milanese were understandably upset. These weren't just any relics. These were the wise men, the original Christian pilgrims. But Frederick had an army, and Milan had recently been on the losing side of a war. The relics were transferred to Cologne, where they remain to this day, in a golden shrine that makes Fort Knox look understated. Milan's revenge was subtle but effective. They began claiming that they'd kept the really important parts, the skulls, and only given Frederick the boring bones. Cologne countered that they had documentation proving skull ownership. Milan produced counter-damnation. The theological arguments continue to this day, though the tourists seem happy enough taking selfies with whichever bits they're shown. The competition wasn't just between cities. Religious orders fought vicious custody battles over their founding saints. The Franciscans and Dominicans spent decades arguing over who got to keep which bits of their respective founders. The solution? Solomon's steel division. Francis was distributed among several Franciscan churches. Dominic was similarly shared. Everyone got a piece, nobody was happy, and the lawyers made a fortune in canon law fees. Perhaps the most creative solution to relic disputes came from the Abbey of Reading. They claimed to have the hand of St. James, but faced challenges from Compostela, which insisted they had the whole body. Reading's response was genius. They claimed their hand was the one James used to write his epistle, making it more important than the rest of his body combined. Checkmate Compostela. By the mid-13th century, the relic wars had reached a state of mutually assured sanctification. Every major church had its collection, every minor church aspired to one, and the total number of holy body parts in circulation exceeded the number of actual saints by a factor of 12. The authenticating documentation had become an art form unto itself. Papal bulls were forged with such skill that even the popes couldn't tell real from fake. One cardinal reportedly authenticated the same relic for 3 different churches, either through extreme absent-mindedness or extreme profit motivation. Possibly both. And still the theft continued. Monks developed lock-picking skills. Priests learned to forge episcopal seals. Entire orders specialized in what they euphemistically called translation, moving saints from one location to another, usually without the first location's permission or knowledge. The golden age of relic warfare reached its peak with the great St. Nicholas heist of 1289. The merchants of Bari, who'd stolen Nicholas from Turkey 2 centuries earlier, woke one morning to find their crypt empty and a note, "Venice sends its regards." But when the Venetians opened their supposedly stolen sarcophagus, they found only sand and another note, "Nice try." Bari. The real St. Nicholas? Still in Bari, hidden in a secret crypt. The whole theft had been a counterintelligence operation, designed to make Venice look foolish. It worked. Venice retaliated by claiming they'd known all along and had actually stolen St. Mark's nephew instead. Nobody believed them. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine medieval Europe as one vast game of holy hide-and-seek. Monks sneaking through darkened crypts, bishops clutching forged documents, entire cities mobilizing to protect or steal their sacred dead. Dream of midnight chases through cobblestone streets, of saints' bones hidden in barrels and bread ovens, of theological arguments that ended in actual wrestling matches over whose femur was holier. And remember, somewhere in a cathedral treasury there's probably still a saint wondering how he ended up with 6 heads and 12 arms, and why they're all in different countries. The dead travel more in death than they ever did in life, especially when there's prestige and profit involved. The year is 1215, and Pope Innocent III has had quite enough. His desk is piled high with complaints. 3 churches claim to own St. Peter's skull, 5 monasteries are displaying Christ's baby teeth, and someone in Bavaria is selling splinters of Noah's Ark. The Holy See, it seems, needs to step in before every carpenter's shop in Europe starts manufacturing sacred lumber. And so begins the great age of relic regulation, which, in typical medieval fashion, made everything magnificently worse. The Fourth Lateran Council issued new rules. All relics must be authenticated by Rome. No new relics could be venerated without papal approval. Selling relics was strictly forbidden. It was a comprehensive, well-intentioned reform that lasted about as long as a snowflake in hell. The problem, you see, was that the same bishops tasked with enforcing these rules were often the ones profiting from the relic trade. It was like asking wolves to guard sheep. If the wolves were also selling wool on the side, and the sheep were 2,000 years dead. Bishop Albrecht of Magdeburg found the perfect solution. He became the authenticator. For a modest fee, let's call it a documentation donation, he would examine your relic, consult the appropriate texts, pray for divine guidance, and inevitably discover that yes, this was definitely Saint whoever's whatever. His authentication certificates were beautifully written, sealed with enough wax to waterproof a boat, and completely worthless. But Albrecht was an amateur compared to Cardinal Stefano of Naples. Stefano had developed what he called the Scales of Sanctity, a complex pricing system for relic authentication. Toe bones of minor martyrs, 50 gold florins. Apostolic appendages, 200. Anything claiming to be from Christ himself, that required what Stefano delicately termed a substantial offering to support the good works of the Church. The good works, coincidentally, included Stefano's new villa. The authentication process itself became a theatrical performance. The bishop would arrive with great ceremony, accompanied by clerks, scribes, and occasionally a choir. The relic would be displayed on velvet cushions, incense would billow, Latin would be chanted, the bishop would examine the relic with various instruments, magnifying glasses, calipers, and something that looked suspiciously like a jeweller's loupe. Then came the tests. Was the bone unusually heavy? Sanctity adds weight, apparently. Did it smell of roses? A sure sign of holiness. Nothing to do with the perfume applied backstage. Did it bleed when pricked? Amazing how often this miracle occurred, especially when the bishop's assistant had a small vial of pig's blood in his sleeve. After suitable drama, the verdict would be announced. Invariably, the relic was genuine. The documentation would be produced, scrolls of parchment covered in Latin so ornate it looked like decorated pastry, seals would be applied with ceremony, the church would pay its fee. Everyone would pretend this wasn't a commercial transaction. The real innovation came from Rome itself. The Vatican, realizing it couldn't stop the relic trade, decided to control it instead. They established the Sacred Congregation for Indulgences and Sacred Relics, essentially the world's first supernatural regulatory body. The congregation's job was to maintain standards in the relic industry. They created categories. First-class relics, actual body parts, second-class, items touched by saints, and third-class, items touched by saints. It was bureaucracy meets theology meets multi-level marketing. They also started keeping records. The archive of authenticated relics grew into a vast library of dubious documentation. According to their files, St. Catherine of Alexandria had left behind 12 heads, 24 hands, and enough hair to stuff a mattress. When questioned about these mathematical impossibilities, the archivists would shrug. Miracles, they'd mutter, filing away another authenticated finger. But the real money wasn't in authentication. It was in distribution. The Vatican discovered they were sitting on a gold mine of holy remains. The catacombs of Rome contained thousands of early Christian martyrs, most anonymous, all potentially profitable. Enter the catacomb entrepreneurs. These specialists would descend into the ancient burial grounds with shopping lists from churches across Europe. Need a virgin martyr? Try this section. Looking for a soldier saint? Aisle 3. The bones were exhumed, cleaned, and assigned identities based on extremely creative interpretation of barely legible inscriptions. A fragment reading Lumina, Pax Tecum Fi, became St. Philomena, Virgin Martyr, complete with a detailed biography involving anchors, arrows, and an imperious emperor. The fact that the inscription might have just been someone's epitaph saying, "Light and peace be with you, faithful one." Details. The bones were then packaged with what we might call value-added services. A basic skeleton came with authentication papers, but for premium prices you could get a custom-written saint biography, miracle testimonies, satisfaction guaranteed, a decorated reliquary, ongoing theological support for any awkward questions. It was full-service sanctity, Vatican-approved and priced to move. Local bishops, not to be outdone, developed their own authentication methods. The Bishop of Trier created a mystical device he called the sanctometer, essentially a decorated box with some magnets inside. Place a relic near it, and if the needle moved, it was genuine. The needle always moved. The bishop was very rich. The authentication documents became increasingly elaborate. A typical certificate might run to 20 pages, including papal bulls, often forged, witness testimonies, usually fictional, historical chronicles, recently written, miracle accounts, creatively embellished, theological arguments, incomprehensibly dense, official seals, impressively numerous. The seals were particularly important. A well-authenticated relic might have dozens, from bishops, cardinals, abbots, and occasionally royalty. The fact that seal forging had become a cottage industry was politely ignored. In Prague, you could buy a seal of Charlemagne for 10 florins, guaranteed authentic, blessed by monks. The most audacious authentication came from Archbishop Reynold of Cologne. When challenged about the Three Kings relic stolen from Milan, he produced documentation proving that the bones had originally been in Cologne, stolen by Milan, and merely returned to their rightful home. The documents were dated 500 AD. The forgery was so obvious that even other bishops were embarrassed. But the relic stayed in Cologne. Meanwhile, the relic fraud had evolved into new forms. Monks discovered you could create second-class relics by touching items to first-class relics. Touch a cloth to a saint's bone and voila! Sacred fabric. Touch a rosary to that cloth and you have third-class relics. It was sanctity dilution on an industrial scale. One monastery in Bavaria took this to its logical extreme. They had a splinter of the true cross, authenticated naturally. They touched other wood to it, creating second-class relics. Then they touched more wood to those pieces, creating third-class relics. Within a year they were selling ninth-class relics of the true cross. Wood that had touched wood that had touched wood that had... You get the idea. The theological implications were staggering. The profit margins were better. The bureaucracy spawned its own ecosystem. There were relic lawyers who specialized in disputed attributions, relic accountants who maintained inventories of scattered saints, relic insurers who would guarantee your bones against theft. Premiums were high. There was even a relic detective in Venice who specialized in recovering stolen saints. For a finder's fee, of course. The most bizarre development was the emergence of relic futures trading. Merchants would buy rights to saints who were still alive, betting on their eventual canonization. When Bishop Hugh of Lincoln was clearly dying, there was a bidding war for his remains before he'd even stopped breathing. He foiled everyone by insisting on being buried in multiple locations simultaneously. Even in death, supply and demand ruled. By 1250, the relic bureaucracy had become so complex that Rome issued a simplified guide, the Authenticatio Reliquiarum for Dummies, rough translation. It explained in simple Latin how to identify real authentication documents, hint, the ones with the most seals and the highest fees were most genuine. The guide also included helpful tips. If a saint has more than 5 heads, some might be duplicates. Bones that glow in the dark should be tested for phosphorus. The miraculous multiplication of relics typically occurs near gift shops. Blood that stays liquid after centuries might just be wine. But nobody really wanted reform. The system, corrupt as it was, worked for everyone. Churches got their relics, pilgrims got their miracles, bishops got their fees, and Rome got its cut. It was medieval capitalism dressed in holy robes, and business was blessed. So tonight, as you drift toward dreams, imagine vast Vatican archives filled with impossible documentation. Picture bishops with price lists hidden in their prayer books. Think of monks carefully touching 10,000 rosaries to a single saint's knuckle, creating an exponential explosion of holiness. And remember, Somewhere in those archives there's probably still a file documenting the sale of the Virgin Mary's house, which was in Loretto, and Nazareth, and Walsingham, and several other locations, all authenticated, all genuine, all generating steady revenue for the church. Bureaucracy, it seems, is eternal, even when dealing with the eternal. Sweet dreams, and may your documentation always be in order. Welcome to Glastonbury Abbey, the year 1278. The monks have just made a miraculous discovery in their cemetery. The bones of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, complete with a convenient lead cross, labelling them as such. Never mind that the lettering is suspiciously modern, or that the monks desperately needed money after a recent fire. When you're in the pilgrimage business, you create your own miracles. And business, dear sleepy listener, was booming. By the late 13th century, pilgrimage had evolved from spiritual journey to a massive tourism industry. Every town with a half-decent relic had transformed into what we might recognise today as a holy theme park, complete with gift shops, guided tours, and overpriced accommodations. Let's visit the Abbey of St. Denis, where Prior Marcus has just finished reviewing the quarterly earnings. Candle sales up 300%. Pilgrim badge revenues exceeded projections. In donations through the roof, quite literally. They've had to build a new one. The secret to their success? They've recently acquired the jawbone of Mary Magdalene. Now, the astute among you might note that this jawbone bears a striking resemblance to that of a horse, but Prior Marcus has an explanation. The Blessed Magdalene was known for her strong speech in defence of our Lord. Naturally, her jaw would be robust. The pilgrims don't question it. They're too busy buying officially blessed Magdalene jaw pendants, small, medium or deluxe, Magdalene jaw healing oils, olive oil with a hint of myrrh, and limited edition Magdalene jaw prayer cards, illustrated by Brother Francis, who's never seen a human jaw but has a vivid imagination. The transformation of pilgrimage sites into commercial enterprises was remarkably thorough. Take Canterbury, for instance. After Thomas Becket's martyrdom, the cathedral developed what modern marketing executives would recognise as a fully integrated visitor experience. First, you'd enter through the Pilgrims' Gate, where helpful monks would offer to exchange your money for Canterbury coins, special currency blessed by the Archbishop and accepted only at cathedral shops. The exchange rate was highway robbery, but the blessing was free. Next came the guided tour. For a small donation, Brother Timothy would share the story of Becket's martyrdom, complete with dramatic pauses and a suspicious red stain on the floor that looked remarkably fresh for a century-old bloodstain. "Some say it still bleeds on holy days," Timothy would whisper. It did, especially when the donation box was light. The actual shrine was a masterpiece of crowd control. Pilgrims would queue for hours, shuffling forward in lines that wound through gift shops, past food vendors, and around donation boxes strategically placed at every turn. By the time you reached Becket's tomb, you'd spent more than a month's wages on candles, badges, ampullae of holy water, and a sandwich that cost 3 times what it would outside the cathedral walls. But Canterbury was amateur hour compared to Rome. The Eternal City had turned pilgrimage into a science. They offered package deals, visit 7 churches in one day and receive a plenary indulgence. See the chains that bound St. Peter. Marvel at the stairs Christ climbed to face Pilate. Recently imported from Jerusalem, some assembly required. Roman entrepreneurs had developed specialized services for every budget. Poor pilgrims could rent a staff and cloak to look more pious. Wealthy ones could hire professional prayers to handle the tedious bits while they toured the sites. For the right price, you could even buy a certificate stating you'd completed the pilgrimage without actually doing it, pre-signed by understanding bishops who recognized that not everyone had time for actual spiritual journeys. The accommodations industry flourished alongside the relics. Every pilgrimage site sprouted inns, hostels and taverns. The Blessed Becket's bedchamber in Canterbury offered rooms with views of the Holy Cathedral, if you squinted and leaned dangerously out the window. The Magdalene's Rest, near Vézelay, promised beds blessed by monks. The blessing consisted of Brother André stumbling through the rooms with incense, usually hung over. The food was equally sanctified and priced accordingly. Pilgrim's Pottage, yesterday's leftovers, with a new name, cost twice the regular price, but came with a blessing. Holy bread, regular bread, was available at premium rates. And don't get me started on the wine. Every vineyard within 50 miles of a pilgrimage site suddenly discovered their grapes grew on land once walked by saints. The badge business alone was worth a fortune. These pewter souvenirs were the medieval equivalent of, my parents went to Canterbury and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Except the shirts were badges and they were definitely not lousy. They were sacred. And expensive. Very expensive. Each pilgrimage site had its own unique designs. Canterbury offered Beckett's head, anatomically questionable. Compostela had cockle shells. St. James apparently loved seafood. Rome had crossed keys. Peter's, supposedly, though they looked suspiciously like the locksmiths down the street. Wearing these badges was crucial. They proved you'd completed the pilgrimage, which came with spiritual benefits and, more importantly, social bragging rights. A well-travelled pilgrim might wear dozens, clanking like a medieval wind chime. It was virtue signalling with actual signals. But the real money was in miracles. Every shrine needed them to stay competitive. The monks at Mont Saint-Michel kept detailed miracle ledgers, like supernatural accountants. John of Bristol, cured of lameness after touching the archangel's sword, donation 50 shillings. Marie of Anjou, barren for 7 years, conceived after praying at the shrine, donation 2 gold rings and a cow. Pierre of Normandy, claimed cure from blindness, investigation pending. He recognized his wife from across the square, donation minimal. The miracle verification process was flexible. Generally, if the donation was substantial, the miracle was genuine. Poor pilgrims found their miracles took longer to manifest, often requiring multiple visits and incremental payments. It was faith on the installment plan. Some sites got creative with their attractions. The Abbey of Fécamp claimed to have a vial of Christ's blood that had miraculously arrived by sea in a hollow tree trunk. They built an entire visitor centre around it, complete with a replica of the holy tree. The original had sadly rotted. A multimedia presentation, 1 monk with different voices. A tasting menu of foods Christ might have eaten. Bread, fish, more bread. A gift shop selling vials of Fécamp water, touched by the holy blood vial. The competition between pilgrimage sites was fierce. When Cologne Cathedral started attracting crowds with the Three Kings relics, nearby Aachen suddenly discovered they had Christ's swaddling clothes. Not to be outdone, Trier announced they had the holy robe worn by Christ at his crucifixion. The fact that there were enough holy robes in circulation to outfit a small army was politely ignored. Marketing tactics became increasingly sophisticated. Shrines hired town criers to advertise their relics in neighbouring cities. They commissioned miracle plays dramatizing their saints' lives, with significant artistic license. Some even offered loyalty programs. Complete 10 pilgrimages, get the 11th free. The most audacious marketing came from the Abbey of Hyllis, which claimed to possess a vial of the holy blood. Their selling point? The blood was still liquid. Pilgrims would pay premium prices to see the miraculous fluid, which chemical analysis centuries later revealed to be honey-coloured with saffron, but it certainly looked impressive in candlelight. By 1300, the pilgrimage industry had developed its own ecosystem. There were professional pilgrims who made a living guiding groups to shrines and steering them to shops that paid commissions. There were relic rental services for churches wanting to boost attendance temporarily. There were even pilgrimage critics who reviewed shrines like medieval TripAdvisor. Canterbury, 5 stars for the shrine, 2 stars for the overpriced ale. The theological implications of this commercialization were occasionally discussed, usually by killjoy theologians who weren't getting their cut. They complained that pilgrimage had become more about profit than piety, more about souvenirs than salvation. They were absolutely right. They were also absolutely ignored. Because at the end of the day, everyone was benefiting. The church got rich, the towns prospered, the pilgrims got their badges and bragging rights, and salvation was available for purchase at competitive rates. It was capitalism wearing a cassock. The free market meets the freed soul. So tonight, as you prepare to meet your own dreams, imagine those medieval highways crowded with pilgrims. See them trudging toward their holy destinations, purses growing lighter with every step, badges multiplying on their cloaks like spiritual frequent flyer miles. Picture the shrine keepers counting their coins by candlelight, the relic merchants planning their next acquisition, the innkeepers watering down the ale just a little more, because these pilgrims won't be back to complain. And remember, somewhere in a cathedral gift shop, a monk is still selling splinters of the true cross. They're authenticated, blessed, and surprisingly abundant for a tree cut down 2,000 years ago. But who's counting when there's salvation to be sold? Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of Pilgrim's markup. And so we arrive at the end of our tale in the waning years of the medieval period. The year is 1478, and Prior Wilhelm of Augsburg is conducting his annual relic inventory. It's a lengthy process. According to his careful records, the cathedral possesses 17 fingers of St. Peter. Peter apparently had some spare hands tucked away. 4 complete skulls of St. John the Baptist. 1 as a child, 1 as a young man, 1 as an adult, and 1 just in case. Enough fragments of the true cross to build a modest ship. 6 holy nails, from the standard 3-nail crucifixion naturally. And something labelled simply Saint, with a question mark, because even Wilhelm has lost track. The great relic hangover had begun. By now, the mathematics of medieval anatomy had reached truly spectacular heights of impossibility. Saint Apollonia, patron of dentists, had left behind approximately 400 teeth across various churches. Either she was part shark, or someone had been getting creative with livestock molars. Saint Catherine of Alexandria had been so thoroughly distributed that reassembling her would require advanced degrees in both theology and jigsaw puzzles. In Rome, a beleaguered papal secretary attempted to catalogue all registered relics. He gave up after documenting 42 holy prefixes, each with ironclad authentication. The theological implications of Christ requiring multiple circumcisions were so mind-bending that the secretary retired to a monastery and took up brewing. The beer was excellent. The questions remained unanswered. On his birthday, the vicar set aside a section, the one he'd been unanswered. The saturation point had been reached in Germany, where one Frederick III of Saxony had assembled a collection of 19,013 holy relics. Let that number sink in as you drift towards sleep. 19,013 pieces of saints, martyrs, and divine accessories. His castle at Wittenberg had become less a residence and more a supernatural warehouse. The catalogue of Frederick's collection reads like the fever dream of a medieval hoarder. A twig from Moses' burning bush, still faintly warm, bread from the Last Supper, miraculously preserved, definitely not last week's, a feather from the Holy Spirit, because, apparently, divine dove's malt, 3 pieces of the Mountain of Transfiguration, it was a very portable mountain, and milk from the Virgin Mary, because, of course, visitors to Frederick's Relic Chapel reported a unique experience. The sheer density of holiness was said to cause spontaneous genuflection, though cynics suggested it might have been the overwhelming smell of preserving oils and aged bone. The donation box at the exit was the size of a wine barrel. It was frequently emptied. But cracks were beginning to show in the sacred facade. In England, a troublemaker named John Wycliffe had started asking awkward questions. If St. Peter had 17 fingers, did that mean he was a mutant? If there were enough pieces of the true cross to build a forest, had the crucifixion taken place on an entire tree plantation? And why did so many saints' bones look suspiciously like animal remains? The bishops responded as they always did, with excommunication and bigger donation boxes. Meanwhile, in Wittenberg, a young monk named Martin was studying Frederick's relic collection with growing skepticism. We won't spoil what happens next, but let's just say it doesn't end well for the relic industrial complex. The signs of oversaturation were everywhere. Venice announced they had acquired the Staff of Moses, only to discover nobody cared. There were already 12 staffs of Moses in circulation. A monastery in Spain revealed they possessed Christ's sandals, but pilgrims yawned. Sandals? How pedestrian. Come back when you have something interesting, like his childhood toys or his carpentry tools. Oh wait, those were already on display in 6 different locations. The inflation of miracles had reached comic proportions. Every relic now promised to cure everything from plague to poor posture. St. Blaise's throat bones cured sore throats, stuttering, and somehow fear of fish. St. Lucy's eyes helped with vision problems, finding lost objects and selecting good melons at market. The bones of St. Christopher didn't just protect travellers, They also prevented tooth decay, improved wine quality, and made your chickens lay more eggs. One cathedral in Germany simply gave up trying to maintain distinctions. They offered the Relic, a mixed bag of bone fragments that could cure whatever ailed you. "It's probably got a bit of everyone in there," the sacristan would explain. "Apostles, martyrs, virgins, the lot. One-stop shopping for salvation." The authentication documents had evolved into their own art form. A typical certificate now included papal bulls, multiple, often contradicting each other, imperial edicts, forged with enthusiasm, testimonials from cured pilgrims, written by monks with good imaginations, sworn statements from witnesses, who were usually dead and couldn't object, theological proofs so convoluted they achieved a kind of magnificent meaninglessness. Seals. So many seals. Seals upon seals. If you couldn't dazzle them with authenticity, bury them in wax. The most spectacular example came from Aachen Cathedral, which produced a 400-page authentication document for Charlemagne's arm bone. The document weighed more than the relic. Reading it required a degree in canon law and significant caffeine. Nobody read it. Everyone was impressed. But perhaps the best illustration of the great relic hangover came from a small parish church in Bavaria. The priest, Father Hermann, had inherited a collection of relics from his predecessor. The inventory was extensive and suspicious. St. George's dragon-slaying sword. Dragons were real in medieval documentation. The Virgin Mary's knitting needles, because even divine mothers need hobbies, a stone from David's sling, labelled the one that missed, and something called the Holy Turnip of Antioch, which nobody could explain but everyone agreed was very sacred. Father Hermann, being a practical man, decided to quietly bury the more dubious items in the church garden. Within a week, pilgrims were reporting that vegetables grown in that soil had miraculous properties. The Holy Turnip cult was born. Hermann gave up and started charging admission to the garden. By 1500, Europe was practically carpeted in relics. Every church had its bones, every monastery its miracles, every cathedral its incomprehensible collection of divine debris. The total number of saints in circulation exceeded the number who had ever lived by a factor of approximately infinity. The Pope, exhausted by centuries of relic authentication, issued a statement that roughly translated to, "Fine, whatever, they're all real, please stop asking." This was not the reform the Church needed, but it was the reform it deserved. And yet the faithful still came. They still prayed before bones of dubious provenance. They still left coins in collection boxes beneath anatomically impossible saints. They still bought badges and ampullae and fragments of fragments of fragments. Because sometimes faith needs something to hold on to, even if that something is probably a pig's knuckle in a golden box. The relic trade stumbled on, wounded but not dead. Even today in cathedrals across Europe you can still see them. Golden reliquaries holding mysterious bones, authenticated by documents nobody reads in languages nobody speaks. The tourists take photos, the faithful light candles, the gift shops sell postcards. And somewhere in a Vatican archive, there's still a file documenting the sale of the crown of thorns. And another one, and another one. Enough crowns for every Friday the 13th from here to eternity. The medieval world collected bodies like we collect phone apps, enthusiastically, indiscriminately, and way beyond the point of reason. They turned death into commerce, bones into business, and salvation into a seller's market. But now, dear listener, as you drift off to sleep in your relic-free bedroom, remember this. Somewhere in Europe, in a forgotten cathedral crypt, there's probably still a box labelled Miscellaneous St. Parts, Contents Unknown. It's authenticated naturally. The papers are in order, the seal is official, and if you listen very carefully on quiet nights, you might hear the sound of medieval merchants still counting their coins, of pilgrims still shuffling through gift shops, of monks still discovering miraculous new remains in suspiciously convenient locations. The dead never rest when there's money to be made. But you, dear listener, you can rest now. Your pilgrimage through this peculiar history is complete. No donation required, no badge necessary, just close your eyes and dream of a time when heaven had a price tag and every church was a sacred butcher shop. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of mysterious toes and entrepreneurial monks. Sweet dreams. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.